is about beat-to-beat variability and calcium and arrhythmogenesis. But before I talk about that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the drug development process. And one of the reasons why the arrhythmia that I'm going to talk about is quite an important one. So as we all know, developing new medicines is a pretty expensive process, and it costs around 800 million euros. And it's very time consuming unless you're looking for a COVID cure. So only 1 in 10,000 to 100,000 molecules ever actually reach the market as drugs. And 1 in 5 molecules won't pass the clinical testing stage due to the negative side effects. So it's really crucial that we are able to sift out all the drugs that are going to cause issues when it gets to the clinic before we invest all that money into them. So we don't get this little jack in the box when we get to real life. So there's one particular side effect that's caused the withdrawal of a number of compounds that have been on the market so over the last 30 odd years. So for example, tafenidine, which was an anti-allergy drug, so it was an antihistamine, which was introduced to the market in 1982, was withdrawn back in 1998, and this caused this side effect, which was torsades de pointes arrhythmia. So what exactly is torsades de pointes arrhythmia? This is an irregular fast heart rhythm that can ultimately lead to ventricular fibrillation and ultimately sudden cardiac death. And this is, you see the definition here. This is the ECG recording of a torsade, which was first recorded back in 1966, when it was first defined by Dessertin, meaning twisting of the points, and it got named that because of the ECG morphology. And there are various risk factors, including being female gender, having a slow heart rate, genetic factors, age, and this can also be drug-induced. But the issue is the occurrence of this arrhythmia isn't very predictable, even though we know some of the risk factors. So it's pretty challenging still. So I just thought I'd put this up because obviously relevance to COVID-19 days. The other week, or the other month now, Trump put a tweet out saying, I hope they will all use hydroxychloroquine. I hope they use it because I tell you what do you have to lose? And somebody tweeted back, sinus rhythm, because obviously this has been shown to cause QT prolongation, as we've been speaking about before. And as also this recent paper showed that these patients actually got torsades de pointes arrhythmia. So how is this linked? What actually causes the torsades de pointes arrhythmia? So here we have a very simplified diagram of a myocyte. We have on the top left, physiologically calcium handling. We have calcium entering through the L-type calcium channel through Cav1.2, as we've been discussing previously, which then comes into the cytoplasm, causes calcium release from the ryanodine receptors, can also bind to the MCU, as Wolfgang was discussing earlier. This calcium coming out of the ryanodine receptor can then trigger myofilament contraction, and then it can be taken out via the NCX, so the sodium calcium exchange, or it can be taken back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum via the circa. However, in some cases, we have a disturbed ion channel function. So for example, a potassium channel may be dysfunctional, such as the delayed rectifier potassium channel, or either the rapid or the fast, as well as calcium channel mutations and sodium channel mutations can all lead to an increase in intracellular calcium. And this increase in intracellular calcium can lead to an increase in action potential duration and ultimately lead to these early after depolarizations, because we're in the area that these can be reactivated for a long period of time, or delayed after depolarizations, which are caused by a reactivation of an activation of the sodium calcium exchange, which causes this inward current, which happens at the end of normal repolarization. And this can lead to what we see here, this fibrillation. So the action potential duration increase seems to drive the increased intracellular calcium and can lead to calcium overload. Therefore, up to now, at least, it's the increase in APD and therefore QT interval that's been used as a surrogate marker for torsades de pointes arrhythmia. But the main question is this actually a sufficient marker? Is this good enough to be able to say, if you have an increased QT, if you have an increased APD, this is going to cause an arrhythmia, or do we need to find other surrogate markers? Well, one such surrogate marker is beat-to-beat variability of repolarization. This is work that I did during my PhD using a compound from AstraZeneca, which at the time was thought to be a useful agent for atrial fibrillation, in fact. And what we showed using a dogma canine model, which I will come back to later on in the presentation, is that if you look at the top figure there, you can see the beat-to-beat variability of repolarization. Whereas if you look at the other one, you can also see the action potential duration. So you can see, for example, with defetilide, which is a pure IKR blocker, which is known to cause torsade, what you see is an increase in action potential duration, and at the same time, you get an increase in beat-to-beat variability of repolarization, which is basically the action potential fluctuating on a beat-to-beat basis. So here it goes, for example, if you look in panel 4, from 522 to 530 to 520 to 513. So it's not, it's an extremely variable entity, and then you ultimately get a torsade point arrhythmia. Whereas with this AZD1305 drug, which was a multi-channel blocker, at least in this experiment, what we saw was a huge increase in action potential duration, but actually the variability went down. And in this experiment, we didn't see any arrhythmias. So if you'd have been taking, for example, just action potential duration, these were monophasic action potentials actually recorded in vivo, what you might have thought this drug was going to cause an arrhythmia in this patient or animal, whereas actually it didn't. So it appeared that the beat-to-beat variability was a much better and more reliable marker of proarrhythmic susceptibility. So we wanted to get to grips with this a little bit more. So we started looking at this at a single cell level. So we isolated cardiac myocytes. These were canine cardiac myocytes, in fact. And what you see here is under baseline conditions, what we have there, we have our fractional shortening contraction on top and our action potentials underneath. Under baseline conditions, we have a pretty low beat-to-beat variability of repolarization. When we gave beta-adrenergic stimulation, at least in this example here, we get an increase in our contraction. We don't get any delayed after depolarizations in these cells, at least. But we don't get an increase in our beat-to-beat variability of repolarization. However, when we introduce an IKS blocker, in this case it was HMR 1556, and we've been talking about calmodulinopathies previously, we also have LonQT1, which is a mutation in the IKS channel, which seems to be brought on, where arrhythmias are especially brought on under sympathetic stimulation. So when we gave the sympathetic stimulation together with the IKS blocker, we get this huge increase in beat-to-beat variability of repolarization, as you can see here. And when this is plotted, obviously, our numbers are a lot higher than they would be normally. So we wanted to try and understand why, in this situation at least, were we having a higher variability of repolarization. So we started by using certain agents to block intracellular calcium. First of all, we used BAPTA-AM, as we heard in Leanne's talk. This is a calcium chelator that fast chelates. And what we saw when we gave HMR and ISO, we saw a similar story to what we saw before, a huge increase in the beat-to-beat variability of repolarization. We're giving BAPTA-AM, so this can just go into the cell by itself. We get, obviously, our contraction goes because we've got no more calcium anymore, but we get a complete abrogation of our variability despite having a larger action potential duration. A similar story was seen when we blocked the sodium-calcium exchanger. So again, we see our HMR and ISO situation is causing a massive increase in our variability, going up to 14.2 milliseconds from 2.6. When we give this SEA0400, which is a sodium-calcium exchange inhibitor, we completely decrease this. So obviously this is telling us that intracellular calcium is playing a vital role in the instigation of this variability. We then looked a little bit further and started thinking about these delayed after depolarizations that we've previously seen. So what you see here, under baseline conditions, we have a nice action potential, a nice contraction, but we don't have any delayed after depolarizations. In these cells, when we started giving isoproterenol, so the beta-adrenergic stimulation, we did start to see some delayed after depolarizations. And what you see here in the top panel is the darker shaded dots are the action potential duration where you have a DAD preceding it. So what you see, start to see at least, is that when you have a DAD, the next action potential is prolonged. And that's even more obvious when we put HMR into the mix, and you really see the differences between a DAD plus and a DAD minus action potential. It's really the DADs that seem to be driving the action potential duration and therefore the BVR. And this was then looked at, this was together with David Eisner's group in Manchester and Andy Trafford. And what they did was we recorded the calcium transients there, and what you could see on a action potential duration and the calcium transient, or on the action potential where there'd been a previous DAD, what you see first of all is that you have a longer action potential. So if you look at the third action potential in that series, it's longer. But also what you see is that the peak of the transient is lower. We'll come back to that shortly. It was also the fact that augmented SR calcium release could also alter BVR. So here again, we have a similar situation to before. We have our baseline situation, our ISO, and our IKS plus ISO situation, where we get an increase in APD, an increase in DADs, and an increase in BVR. Giving ryanodine, tetracaine, and tetracaine completely abrogated the DADs and reduced the BVR. Interestingly, giving caffeine, this was at quite a low concentration, so it was just to make the ryanodine receptors leaky, so they were all leaky, so they were leaking all the time, meant that even though the number of DADs went up, the BVR actually went down because we have a DAD on just about every single beat. We also gave W7 and KN93, which are CAM kinase inhibitors, and they also did a similar thing in terms of reducing the DADs and reducing BVR. And the same was true with magnesium and flecainide, which have been used in the clinic to treat Torsades de Pointes and long QT1. So we now know from this that intracellular calcium is the driver of the BVR. So the question then is, how can this intracellular calcium actually be affecting our membrane? So here we look again, and we can see the main two effector sarcolemmal channels that it could be driving could be the calcium channel or the NCX. So doing some modeling studies together with Jordi Hyman when I was in Maastricht, what they did there was remove different parts of the pathway and see when you had a previous spontaneous calcium release versus when you didn't have a spontaneous calcium release. And you saw changing, when you have the IKS, you had a huge difference. When you had the sodium calcium exchange intact, when you didn't have it intact, you still had that big increase. The only thing when you managed to get rid of this difference between a beat with and a beat without a spontaneous calcium release in terms of APD was when we got rid of the calcium dependent inactivation. So this modeling suggested that it was the L-type calcium channel inactivation was the culprit behind all this. And indeed, we did this in the lab. Again, this was together with David Eisner's lab. And what we did was we recorded the calcium current when we had a DAD, when we had a spontaneous, obviously we couldn't have a DAD, but we had a spontaneous calcium release versus when we didn't have a spontaneous calcium release. And we saw indeed the charge, the current going through was a lot higher when we had a DAD previously because of the L-type calcium channel inactivation and the sensitivity to calcium. Because you may remember from the previous slides that we have a lower calcium transient in those conditions, so therefore we have less inactivation and an increased current, which will be the driving force behind the increased action potential duration. So that was one model that we looked at. So then we thought, okay, what about when we look in a different model, when we don't have overt spontaneous calcium releases? And this was the chronic AV block model, which this was data from Mark Voss's lab. And you can see this is in canines where we ablate the AV node. These hearts then become hypertrophic and they're more susceptible to these Torsades de Pointes arrhythmia. And what one of my old colleagues, Gudrun Anton, showed a number of years ago was that the dynamic modulation of the L-type calcium channel in these animals is increased. So basically, the amount of the calcium channel that can be controlled by the subsarcolemmal calcium in terms of that can actually control the calcium inactivation is a lot larger in these animals. So we wanted to look at what exactly BVR was doing under these conditions. And indeed, so first of all, we gave thapsigargin, which is our inhibitor of SERCA. So we block our reuptake. Under this condition, just by itself, it doesn't make much of a difference. However, when we increase, because here we've got plotted our APD90 versus our beat-to-beat variability, and you can see the trajectory. However, when we initially treat these single cells with a BACE, which is a calcium channel augmenter, what you see is when you give it BACE alone, obviously this trajectory continues, and as your APD goes up, your BVR goes up. However, with thapsigargin on board, that trend isn't the case, and it's shifted to the right. So for a similar amount of APD, you will have a lower beat-to-beat variability. The same was true with caffeine. So when you gave caffeine, this was at a higher concentration. This isn't the same level of caffeine we were using in the previous experiments. This was to completely get rid of all our completely open our RYRs. We managed to shift the curve to the right. So again, for the similar APD, you have a lower BVR. We then used two agents, BAPTA and EGTA, as you heard from Leanne. BAPTA is a chelator that is a very fast chelator, whereas EGTA is a bit slower and can't get into the subsarcolemmal space fast enough to be able to chelate that calcium. And what we saw again was that BAPTA managed to aberrate most of the beat-to-beat variability under these conditions, whereas EGTA was less effective at doing that. So it was calcium near the L-type calcium channel that was driving the BVR, even in this situation when there wasn't any calcium overload. So we don't have spontaneous calcium releases here, but we're still seeing that it's this L-type calcium channel calcium inactivation that's driving our variability. Finally, we looked in another model. So we looked in after myocardial infarction, because we know the T-tubular system is a major hallmark of remodeling after MI, and arrhythmias are a common occurrence. Here we have a couple of examples of some cardiac myocytes, just to show. On the left, you have a normal myocyte. On the right, you have a myocyte extracted from an animal that's had an infarction. You see there's a lot less T-tubules there. And this was work that I did whilst I was in the Cepedo lab in Leuven. And we hypothesized at this point that beat-to-beat variability would also be increased after the MI in the region adjacent to the infarction. But actually what we saw under normal conditions, under baseline conditions, was that there was no differences between our MI animals and our sham animals. However, we thought, let's look back at the literature, and went back to the literature of Schwartz and Vernoli, nearly 40 years ago now, and they showed that under the combination of ischemia and sympathetic stimulation was actually required to induce arrhythmias, and this was actually a feline model. So they had to have the sympathetic stimulation on top of the remodeling to be able to see arrhythmias. And indeed, this was work that was finished off and completed by Matthew Amoni and Yves Dries, who are now in Leuven, who are and still are in Leuven. And basically what they showed, they looked at the different regions within an infarcted heart. So here you can see, this was in vivo. You have an infarct region, you have a peri-infarct region, you have a remote region. So in the infarct region, obviously you haven't got any action potentials because this is dead tissue. In the peri-infarct region, what they saw was that there was many more DADs than in the remote region under sympathetic stimulation. And what you saw indeed is in the number of DADs was increased only in the peri-infarct region in the MI animals. And also in terms of global arrhythmia, they were seen a lot more in the MI animals, as you might expect. But then when they looked at the BVR in these infarct regions versus against away from the infarct region, what they showed was that there was actually an increase in variability with isoproterenol only in the peri-infarcted region. So here we can see on the left, we have our MI animals, where we have an increase in variability in the peri-impact region, whereas this isn't really the case in the remote region. And just to keep it, just to show everybody the rest of the data, we have the sham, where you see that actually isoproterenol and doesn't increase variability in any regions. And this also brings into question potential therapeutics. So how can we, how can we target this? And this was, again, using a CAM kinase inhibitor, as I'd used in previous experiments. And what they showed was getting rid of the, using CAM kinase and getting rid of CAM kinase activity in the MI region, managed to decrease the number of DADs and decreased the variability. So in summary, the myocardial calcium overload DADs and EADs don't only cause arrhythmia via triggered activity, but also by increasing the variability of repolarization, which promotes the reentrant excitation. And this increase in BVR is due, at least in part, to alterations in inactivation of the L-type calcium channel. And this is the case even when we don't have spontaneous calcium release. So just under normal circumstances, our L-type calcium inactivation and the calcium in the dyadic region is probably driving our variability of repolarization. Some data I didn't show today in terms of the interest of time was that calcium release in the dyad actually shows the highest variability. And this is what's contributing to the increased BVR. And we did some confocal microscopy to look at that. And finally, in the MI model, the BVR isn't increased at baseline, but after sympathetic stimulation, the BVR is increased, but this is only in a specific region. So this also highlights the importance of spatial, in addition to temporal dispersion. It may also bring into question ideas of treatment. That just leaves me to thank the following people. So the guys at Maastricht University, who I did my PhD with, and also Jordi, who did the modeling work. A lot of the pig work and this chronic AV block work was done in Karen Sapido's lab in the KU Leuven by the people there. And also I've just come from the University of Birmingham, so there's some work that I haven't shown today, but I wanted to thank them anyway. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Dan, for good talk. At the moment, I don't see any questions typed into the chat box. No, Martin had one. Although buffering cytosolic calcium reduces the beat-to-beat variability, can everything you see be fully or mostly explained by the variability of the SR calcium content as a start asystole?
I wouldn't say it can be, it's probably not at the start of systole, because it's probably also to do with, wow, it's an interesting question. Because you're probably also getting some reloading during the beat anyway via Circa. It depends. It all depends also how fast Circa's working, eh? So I think you could probably account a lot to it, but you've also got differences. You know, you will also have differences depending on which RYRs and which LTCCs are coupled, for example, and that will also play a big role.
Okay, at the moment, I don't see any, Gert came up, any contribution of connexin 43 hemichannels that are activated by calcium.
So that's a very interesting question. I believe there is some work going on that, but I'm not 100% sure of the data at the moment. So I know Luc Leibart is working on that. So I think there may be, but I'm not 100% sure. So don't take me as gospel.
Okay, in the interest of time, I would suggest that we are taking a break.